Welcome to panel 2. We'll go. The previous panel was very interesting. We talked about sovereignty, but let's see now if the regulations, the European regulations, are compatible with the sovereignty. They help, or they make difficulties in order to implement the European strategy. I have 25 excellent colleagues. Mr. Antonis Ioannou is Antonis. I'm here at the Digital Security Authority of Cyprus. Antonis is a cybersecurity consultant at the Digital Security Authority, the Cyprus national cybersecurity body, which implements NIS2, runs the national CSIR, and serves as the country cybersecurity certification authority. Right. Welcome, Antonis. Mr. Ciaran Riordan, Director of European Policy at Philips Foundation. Okay, Ciaran working on EU open source policy in Brussels since 2004, and he played several role in coordinating the open source community's input during the CRA negotiations. Welcome, Chairman. Matthias Silver, Senior Manager Developer Policy from GitHub. Over 15 years in EU policy, copyright, transparency, and open data. Earlier at Wikimedia, the European Parliament and German digital rights organizations. Welcome, Matthias. Mr. Madeline Nick, EU Policy Advisor, Open Source Security Foundation, representing the Linux Foundation and Open Source Security Foundation in Europe, a telecom engineer turned policy expert working at the Initiative 3 Cybersecurity Regulation Technical Standard, and Theodoros Karounos, member of Executive Board in GFOS, the central figure in Greek open technology policy, coordinating great projects as the ARIA, Greensland's Open Government Transparency Program, and worked as a director in the digital government sector in GRNet. So,
may I ask you to use the microphones? So that would help. And if there's any noise that you don't like, I believe there's one that you can put them on the table, or you can have them up on the floor with someone.
So, welcome all. I will try to draw the scene of today. Today is the 16th of June. 5 days ago, the first obligations of the Cyber Resilience Act became applicable. In 3 months from now, manufacturers across Europe will have to report actively exploited vulnerabilities within 24 hours, and the full weight of the lands in December 2027. So we are not here to debate a proposal. The Act is law, it is in force, and the clock is running. The question has shifted from what should the rules be to can we actually implement them, and at what cost. I want to open by putting 5 tensions on the table, not as my conclusions, but as questions. I hope this panel will wrestle with. So the first one is about who survives. The cost of CRA compliance is largely fixed. It does not scale down. For a small or medium European integrator building open source solutions for a municipality, the SBOMs, the vulnerability handling processes, the documentation, the conformity assessment, can consume a serious share of the fee margin. For a hyperscaler, the same cost is a rounded error. So here's the uncomfortable question. How many small and medium European firms will simply close or stop placing products on the market because they cannot carry a compliant cost design without them in mind? And these are not marginal companies, they are the backbone of Europe's digital economy. The second is the mirror image of the first. If the small close, who is left? The large established vendors, most of them non-Europeans, who absorb the cost effortlessly and who are frankly better prepared. So does regulation meant to strengthen European resilience end up consolidating the market in the hands of the very players Europe says it wants to depend on less? And the third is about what compliance actually buys us in terms of sovereignty. And here I'd offer a concrete example. A large US cloud provider can be fully compliant with the European cybersecurity rules and still be legally obliged under US Cloud Act to hand over European data to US authorities, regardless of where that data physically sits, sometimes without even informing the client. So compliance is not the same as sovereignty. A system can be certified, audited, secure on paper, and still not be ours. So does the CRA close that gap, or does it quietly leave it wide open? The fourth is whether any of this will even work as intended. We've seen the data. Over half of manufacturers still rely passively on upstream open source for security fixes. Most European SMEs are still unfamiliar with the CRA. There is genuine doubt about whether there will be enough notified bodies. So, if enforcement is partial and uneven, as it almost certainly will be in the early years, what's the real benefit we're buying with all this cost? And who in the end captures the cost as revenue? The compliance industry, the consultancies, the law firms. And fifth, perhaps the most important, is about competitiveness. There is a phrase that has become almost a cliché on technology cycles. The US innovates, China replicates, and Europe regulates. It's because there is truth in it. We are extraordinarily good at writing rules. The question this panel has to confront honestly is whether the CRA, for all its genuine merits in security, adds one more layer to a regulatory stack that is quietly making Europe a harder place to build a technology company. Or whether done right, it will become the opposite. A mark of quality, a competitive advantage, the thing that makes European open source the trusted choice. Which of those two futures we get is not decided by the text of law. It is decided on how we implement it and whether we support the small players who actually deliver European sovereignty on the ground. As you understand, I don't have the answers to these 5 questions, but I have 5 people. Here we can take them on. So, let's start with Antonis. And Antonis, you see where the regulation meets really the national authority that has to actually implement the CRA and needs to on the ground in Cyprus. So let me ask you, what only a regulator can answer? Does a small member state have the capacity, the people, the notified bodies, the budget to enforce these frameworks by the deadlines? Where is the biggest implementation gap? And from the authority side, is open source a help or a complication when you are securing critical infrastructures?
Thank you for the questions. My first note.
I think this one.
Okay. So thank you for the questions. My first point is that for CRA and CSA, we have more questions than answers. So I'm following up the work of the CRA basically. For the CSA, now we have a proposal for a change, for a review. But for the CRA, I have a lot of information for the problems. I don't have the answers, but I can comment on all your questions. As a small country, we participate in all the fora for the CRA. For the notifying authorities, we have a meeting tomorrow. For the technical group, we had a meeting last week. The ADCO group, this group is co-chaired by Cyprus. It's Germany and Cyprus. And we have the meeting in 2 weeks. And so we are trying to follow up all this work. The Commission is trying a lot to put all this in place. and the challenge is very big. What are the problems? And I'll start with some problems and maybe some information and probably some answers. Standardization issues. We are waiting for the standards for the CRA. We have the first drafts, the first comments. The deadline is next year. The vulnerability standards are almost there. But it's a challenge to have all the standards ready by December 2027. Of course, we need the standards in hand in order to be used from the notifying authorities, from the SMEs, to be prepared. So this is a challenge. A lot of SMEs ask for some delay. The answer is no. There is no delay. You have to do some intermediate, take some intermediate steps. There is a problem with notifying authority, notified bodies. So, and as you mentioned, there had to be the kind of section 3, I think, where all this part has to be implemented on the 11th of June. Of course, this means that the CAPs, the certification bodies, and the laboratories have to be prepared in order to receive applications from SMEs. They are not there. And there is also a problem of accreditation. The solution proposed is an intermediate step for accreditation, not to have full accreditation of these notified bodies, but to have in an intermediate step, to have a discussion with the European accreditation in case we can find a solution. The Commission is trying, is pushing, but I don't know the answer. I don't know if we can find this solution. The other option is to use the notified bodies from the RED directive to migrate to CRA. That's one option. And of course, we have some pilot projects for the critical products of the CRA to use the certification from the EUCC. We have some pilot exercises in Athens 2 weeks ago. We are waiting for the result, so that's another route. But okay, I don't think they will solve the problem. The problem is there. So that's why I said we have more answers. Now, about the open source, this is another issue. If you go to the side of the Venisa, you can find the Q&A or from the Commission, I'm not sure where is the Q&A. There are questions about the open source. One question was about the use of open source if they are not in the scope of the CRA. In that case, there's a clear answer. They can use it because it's not part of the CRA. But in other cases, now that we are trying as a Commission to have an expert to work for the voluntary security programs for attestation. But it's something.
Everything okay?
Okay.
It's something we are discussing now, and we are waiting from the Commission to prepare a paper for this. So we know the problem, Commissions know the problem, and we are trying to find a solution. The big question is whether we will be there in December 2027, and that's a big question. Okay, I can continue later, because there are a lot more points on all these issues.
I hope that we have an active discussion here.
Yeah.
Chiaran, you helped shape the CRA's open source provisions. The open source steward is a brand new legal category that is still frankly undefined. Does it actually protect maintainers in practice, or does it just shift the anxiety downstream onto the great small manufacturers who suddenly become manufacturers for code that they didn't write?
So I think a lot of the anxiety around stewards and the various specific parts of the Cyber Resilience Act, it's based on an old thinking that the free and open source ecosystem used to be a very small lobby, a very small voice in European policy and global policy. And we were always worried that when they make a small change to the patent law or to the copyright law, it could be something that's devastating for free and open source software. But if they think that this is just a niche topic, then they'll implement it anyway. So the introduction of stewards is a much lighter regime compared to what proprietary software gets. And so it's a much easier system. But it is unclear. We still don't know exactly how it's going to work out. We don't know the dynamics. For our ecosystem, it's also very different because for 40 years we built a legal framework based on our licenses and our policies of our projects. And it was always internal. It was always, what would we like to do with our software? What would we like other people to get when they get our software? And so now that free and open source software has finally gotten to the stage where not only it went global already 20 or 10 years ago, but now it's been acknowledged. Everyone sees how massive and how much the world depends on free and open source software. And so now we have a new context that the European Commission is publishing an updated open source strategy. There's the Cloud and AI Development Act, which has clearing clauses about open source. We have a lot of funding, which specifies that things must be done in open source and free software. So we're no longer something that is at risk of being forgotten in the legislative procedure, and that some poorly written text will make life terrible for us. And in fact, the European Commission is now trying to finance free and open source software and even develop it. The European Commission is now even financing companies in other parts of the world, in Canada and South Korea and Japan, to write software that the European Union will use. And so if they're going to use our tax money to pay companies in other countries, it shows how important the collaboration is. And this means that I think it's very unlikely that the Commission will spend so much time trying to encourage the use and the development and financing free and open source software and trying to make a global network of collaborators, and then at the same time use the CRA like a punishment or like a protectionist tool or anything else that would make life difficult. So there are limits to my optimism as well. Things go wrong. On the standardisation front of the Cybersecurity Act, that looks like a challenge that I don't see how that's going to be fixed. It's going in not a very ideal direction, and the timelines and the procedure make it difficult to change that in time. But in general, the attitude we're getting from the Commission is much more about they want, as Thibaut Kleiner said earlier, the goal is for security to be in the genes of the software. And as long as we are also working towards that goal, and why not? But more security isn't a bad thing. I think that we will get a lot of cooperation, and if things need to be tweaked in the future, or if we need an extra strategy or an extra support plan, it looks like the European Commission will be willing to work with us rather than ignore us as some niche that isn't important to them. So I think this is why things like the concept of steward, which won't even be relevant until December 2027. The first thing we have to look at is the main part that becomes applicable this year is the vulnerability reporting. And to know whether or not you have to report your vulnerabilities, you have to know, are you a manufacturer or not? So then you have to look at the definition of manufacturer. And then if you are a manufacturer, you have to know what software you have in your devices, so that if you see a vulnerability for a certain package, you know you have a responsibility. So you also have to have some kind of SBOM or some kind of documentation about your software. So in September, I think people should be focusing on understanding whether or not they are a manufacturer, getting an inventory, an SBOM of what is in their software, and then figuring out their vulnerability reporting obligations and making a procedure. That's the first thing to focus on. The steward regime, we can leave that until a bit later. It will be a bit clear, it will be a bit messy, but I'm less pessimistic than many people.
Thank you. I think that this role of owner of the product and the integrator is now in a gray zone with the CRA. We have to think about it, how much an integrator involves, in the implementation of the deployment and the software. So, thank you, Matthias. You mentioned you flagged Article 25 on our conversation for the voluntary security attestations. And the Commission now wants to expedite the delegated act. From GitHub's vantage point, where most of the world's open source actually lives, can Article 25 generally lower the compliance burden for the small, or does it risk quietly turning maintainers into unpaid compliance workers? And what would a good delegated act look like versus one that backfires?
So now I'm in the interesting position of basically out-optimize or be in a much more optimistic position than I usually are. The world is strange right now, but there are glimmers of hope, and I will grasp them whenever they are. When it comes to software security, the overwhelming consensus is that there's a lot of duct tape and hope and optimism when there should be rough and rigorous tests, proper documentation, and state-of-the-art instead of just work on it until it somehow compiles. And if the CRA is going to raise awareness on good practices that should be implemented anyway, it would have already been a huge success. So in this regard, the signals I hear from market surveillance authorities are giving me hope as well, because the market surveillance authorities that I spoke to do not think about 27 as the date in which they start enforcing the CLA in the sense of you get a penalty and you get a penalty and you get a penalty. They are thinking about these days as let's start with an education phase and let's talk about what the obligations actually are. And when you look at the obligations and what they actually are in Article 13, for example, they are not as terrible as some might want you to believe. So if there's a manufacturer, small, large, my first question is there an obligation in a CRA which you shouldn't be doing anyway because it's in your interest to have secure software? I do not know how to write secure software when you don't even know what your dependencies are and whether you're tracking whether there are vulnerabilities, published ones, on the software using. So it doesn't require a CRA to start working on SBOM and other technologies and other workflows to understand it. And now we're coming to Article 13.5 that specifically tasks manufacturers with obligations whenever they use third-party components. These can be open source, but they don't have to be open source in order for 13.5 to apply. And the due diligence spelled out there is, again, not as terrifying as someone would like to be. So I would really like to see an honest calculation about the actual compliance cost if you follow the spirit and the letter of the CRA. And then there is the question of, is there still room for optimization? And the hope is that if someone takes a close look at an open source component, is this an information that can be shared? Is this an information that can be somehow made applicable to assist manufacturers in their due diligence obligations? I believe there is. I believe that the work that this CRA actually requires is not terrifying, and it doesn't require many steps that go beyond a couple of honest checks. And I read as well the expedition phrase in the European Commission's communication on the European Sovereignty Package, saying that they want to expedite. It's in order not to backfire as a delegated act on a voluntary security attestation program, it first needs to be compliant to European law. And the blueprint is already there in Article 290 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU. The European Commission has a really great defined and rather narrow path in which they can write this implementing act. So most of the information should be already out there. I have looked at this. I believe that there is a room for making it easier. I also want to note, and this is important, No one has to wait for an Article 25 program for voluntary security attestations, because you could still, right now, as of this moment, issue security attestations. They wouldn't be privileged in the way Article 25 could, in theory, do this. But if you are in a position to look at code, you are happy to document this and to make it accessible to anyone else, to help anyone else to lower the burden of compliance. This is why I'm optimistic. It's not optimism in the sense everything will be fine on its own, but it's that there is a clear path towards making the burden easier. And there are many parts that still could backfire, of course. One is the big question about maintainers of open source software drowning in reports, drowning in please fix my compliance for me thing, which quite frankly they are entitled to say no, but even saying no takes some effort. If this is an opportunity for someone, I don't know, I think so, but it's outside of my expertise, but I believe that there is overall, it's a great time to be alive.
So thank you. As I understand from your answer, it's a point of view, the perspective of an engineer or the legal perspective. So it's how we are going to see this this act as a lawyer or as a software engineer. So that's a
or as a human being who wants to live in a world where software doesn't explode and bites you in the face. I think there is a common consensus here about I want to be in a world where the stuff I use doesn't hurt me, doesn't hurt anyone, doesn't expose information in a way that I don't want. And so software security is part of that. And quite frankly, if it takes a law for you to write secure software, I might have a problem with your attitude. Not you with you as a person, but with whoever expresses this to me, that they are waiting for a law to start working on secure software. There are best practices right now.
So, Martin, artificial intelligence. So, artificial intelligence, especially the last year, writes code, reviews, and attacks sometimes open source code running European public administrations, and not only to them. So, net gain, our new attack surface, and how should CRA's vulnerability handling resume cope with vulnerabilities both discovered and generated by AI?
Firstly, thank you very much for having me. Secondly, thank you very much for the question. Even though, can we have the microphone? Yeah, I will take this one. I hope you can hear me now. Firstly, thank you very much for having me. Secondly, thank you very much for the question. I have tried to capture some of the notes while my panelists were talking. Yes, this is so diverse, this panel is so diverse, and AI, of course, could have been missed from this one. Indeed, in the past year we have seen that AI has known a tremendous growth, but people are talking only about AI vulnerability detection in the open source world. Of course, if you point out an AI towards something that is open, of course you'll have those results. But I've heard also that those AI models have detected much more vulnerabilities in closed source. So let's be a little bit mindful when we say that AI can be or can present a danger for open source. If open source uses security by design, security by default principles, and as Matthias highlighted, security best practices, I don't think AI has any chance then. Additionally, we are talking about AI-detected vulnerabilities, but no one talks yet about filtering of those vulnerabilities using AI or patches using AI. I think we have to see also the positive outcomes of this. As you highlighted very well, AI nowadays is extremely helpful in helping us creating code, in helping us creating documents, in helping us fastening the testing process, or enhancing the coverage of everything that we have in our products in terms of supply chain detection or S1 creation. Why not see these kind of positive things? But in every aspect, human intervention is very much needed. Everyone is reading the news, the public information is available about models. We have to see also the advantages of those things and how using such models we can practically enhance the security posture of the open source software. And coming back to what Marcus said previously and what also Karen highlighted, supply chain security is an essential requirement and it's not tied up to the AI or to the human. Of course, human beings are there and should have taken care of those principles from the beginning, no matter if AI is in game or not. AI now comes and indeed helps detecting those, but in the future, or I think also nowadays, can help us creating the patches for those vulnerabilities. Additionally, as you mentioned AI, we have to go a step behind and connect it to CRA, but from a higher perspective. Nowadays, CRA expert group and standardization organizations are working on the blend between AI Act and CRA. And it's essential to know that no matter if you are having a product that deals with AI, that creates AI, that has an LLM model inside, firstly you have to secure that product from CRA perspective. After that you secure it from AI perspective. But the bases are related especially to the security of the product itself, which, of course, they will be handled by the CRA. I saw that at the level of CRA expert group, they have mentioned multiple times that they are working nowadays on this kind of guideline for interplay between AI Act and CRA. I've seen that also at the level of GTC 21. Of SEM, where the standards are created for AI Act, and they have started exactly from this presumption, from this thing that firstly the product is secured by CRA, and after that we handle the security parts of the AI. So, coming back to what my panelist said, we are living in a very complex puzzle nowadays, only regarding CRA. If we add on top of that AI Act as well, it's extremely complicated for manufacturers, for the ones that will handle the burden of compliance. Because as Karen mentioned, stewards benefit from a very light regime in terms of compliance with CRA, and upstream has no obligations. We have to be sure that in upstream, every bit of the code that we create by human being or with the help of AI is properly secured. So secured by design, secured by default principles, as highlighted in one of the most recent publications by NISA, have to be our main principles in dealing with the code and in dealing with the security posture of our projects, no matter if they are upstream or downstream. I could continue for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. I think that everybody will have a chance to have a general comment about what we said. And I'm coming to Thodoros. Thodoros, if it's as a choice, do we want European public administrations with permanent tenants of closed foreign platforms or co-owners of open infrastructure? The case that is hypothetical, under the US Cloud Act, as I said, an American provider can be compelled to hand the European country state data to the US government, even on the European soil, even fully NIS compliant. So compliance doesn't equal sovereignty. What real options does a small European country have? And is open source self-hosting now the only genuine path, or is that too soon?
as was said before by the previous participants, we're in a very peculiar situation because there are many issues, operational issues regarding regulation, but there's a real issue regarding security, cyber security, because we live in a world where, let's say, two structural problems exist at the same time. One has to do with the open nature of the internet, because as we all know, it was built with a libertarian approach that did not envision the world that we live now, right, and how things have come up. And on the other side, we have actors, state actors, mainly from totalitarian states and cybercrime groups that utilize this, let's say, asymmetry that in open societies like the European Union, the European countries, we want to have open internet and open democracy. But at the same time, we live, let's say, in a reality that it's actually a cyber war is going on. Even we don't realize it, but it's there. And we know that the actors are there. They're not internal actors mainly, they're external actors. And they are mainly come from totalitarian states. And this asymmetry, it's very difficult. And it's understandable that all this regulation framework tries to more or less formulate our defenses on different levels. And it becomes very difficult. So if we come down to, let's say, a small public administration, a ministry, and so on, the solution is obvious, but it's very difficult. It's obvious that has to do with self-hosting, that as much as you self-host, you are able to maintain your infrastructure, you are in better position when you buy services from hyperscalers. But then, this is not very, it's not simple and it's not viable for everyone. So at these crossroads, let's say larger European countries like Germany, France and so on are better equipped to provide such types of solutions than smaller countries or smaller markets. And somehow there's no other way than the European Union and the European Commission to actively support smaller countries and smaller markets in implementing and maintaining open source solutions. As was said before, the digital common setting is probably one of the solutions, but it will take time to provide open source infrastructure for everyone to be, let's say, easy to use and easy to maintain. Let's hope that within the next year we will see, let's say, what was said before, a change in culture, and bigger countries help smaller countries to implement open source solutions at all levels.
As I understand, the main pillar of your thought is that human capital in European level is very important in order to have an equality between European countries when they are big or small. So I think, of course, bigger countries like Germany and France can be the leaders of this initiative of open source self-hosted infrastructure. But I think that every country could contribute by the human capital that could provide in order to this common vision. So, after this first round of questions, I wanted to ask all of you last question, and of course, start a general discussion about what we said today. Openness now extends beyond software. open hardware, the RISC V initiative for in the hardware computing, even open manufacturing. Do you think that is there a limit to openness when it comes to security? A point where transparency stops protecting and start exposing. Of course, you can add, some general comments about the conversation. So, Mr. Ilan.
For the first part, if somebody else wants to start,
Okay.
for the open
I don't know.
manufacturing.
We have about 1 minute each.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Chiara? Yeah, please.
So the open hardware thing is very interesting because for decades the open hardware ecosystem was a very hobbyist thing because nobody owned the factory for manufacturing this hardware, and so it was people with soldering irons in the garage. All of a sudden now the shortage of chips has turned it into a critical part of the technology strategy of the European Union. But I think the adaptations we have to make towards complying with all this regulation, for example, in Eclipse Foundation, we are registered in Europe. We have 66% of our staff is in Europe. We have no office or any entity in the US. We set up then the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, orcwg.org, to gather people who have to work on compliance. And then this gathers companies who support free and open source software and companies who don't really care about it, but they have to do compliance as well. And so it's kind of a neutral group. And this is just one of the adaptations we have to be able to comply with all these things. I guess it would be nice if we didn't have to do all that work, but this is just the world moves forward and we adapt, and so that's where we have people collaborating to produce documents that will help the compliance work easier.
Okay. Matthias, about the question and last comment.
So I'm always tempted by this idea of people falling in the trap of security by obscurity, saying that not disclosing something is somehow helping you. And yes, you can construct a scenario in which the non-disclosure of information will somehow give you a small time or raise the level of effort required to somehow reverse engineer it. The downsides are not technical in nature. The downsides affect the ability of everyone else to participate in the debate, to share in. I would strongly recommend against this approach, unsurprisingly, but at the same time I would rather look not at the security implication, but at the society implications of not disclosing policies, procedures, proposals. So if, for example, the European Union happens to work on age verifications, age assurances levels, you can have very valid opinions about whether we should do it at all, what the downsides are, but at least the common ground is if you do it anyway, do it in a way that anyone else can expect it and can work on whether this is actually a zero knowledge proof that limits the amount of data that's actually transported, and then react if proofs and successful attacks are found. It's not a silver bullet, it's not a solution, but at least it's a principle you can work with in policy. And I would recommend to do it in CRA, in CISA, in other fields as well. Thanks.
Adam.
Yeah, from my perspective, we have to conclude with the global characteristic of open source. There is no European source, that's a clear thing. And we have to be extremely mindful about what we consume and what we integrate. As it has been mentioned already, there is a huge percentage of companies that are still relying passively on upstream fixes. And that's a very bad thing. One of our most recent reports coming from instrumentation research highlighted that only 32% of the respondents are creating an SBOM, and 51% of the companies are relying passively on upstream fixes. That will not work in the context of CRA compliance or in the context of EU cybersecurity strategy, because we have talked about CRA, but international also needs to, there is also CSA, there is also GDPR, and there is also DORA, even though it's not part of that, but it's a lex specialist on top of these two. And we have also Data Act, AI Act, and many other legislations that are containing this kind of characteristics related to security. And the common point, or the common direction between all of those, the common layer between all of those, is securing supply chain. Again, we have to be mindful with what we consume, how we integrate them, and how we maintain them. Additionally, recently Black Duck has reported OSS risk assessment report, and there they highlighted 90% or 90%. 92% of the code bases investigated are having components older than 4 years. More than 90% of the code bases are having components that are not know any update in the past 2 years. And the list can continue. This is why due diligence process is extremely important, and due diligence is not only about the security distinctions, or only about SBOs. It's much wider than that. And we have to be very, very careful on how open source are consumed. And we have to return back. If we continue to consume passively open source software, we will not arrive at the point where we will reach the compliance with the CRA, especially when it comes to third-party components and, more importantly, security supply chain. Thank you.
I will start my comment with one discussion we had years ago at the Commission. I was attending the standardization committee of the DG Growth. And there was a question there, are you trying to standardize innovation? And there was a big question, a big discussion about this issue. And I understand that this is a policy issue, but I agree with the previous speaker that the methodology we use right now in Europe for all new approach directive, CRA is NLF. It's like machinery directive, it's like the red directive, it's similar, very similar. So what we are trying to do in Europe with this, let's say, over-regulation is, okay, we have standardization, then we have the presumption of conformity. In some cases, we can use other standards, self-declaration and all this. But for the critical products, you should have the standard, then you should have the notified body. So you have to pass from all these steps in order to ensure that the delivery, the declaration of conformity is valid. So this is the idea. If we change this and then we can say, okay, you rely on your responsibility for, let's say, an open source manufacturing and some other ideas, that's a whole discussion. And then I have another point for the stewards. I think last week we had a question from an SME whether the stewards are obliged to notify, to report vulnerability in September. And the answer from the Commission was yes. So they are, of course we are in the gray zone, but this was the answer given by the Commission from Reluga, that they have to notify even the stewards the vulnerabilities, both.
Thank you.
That's a fresh information.
Okay, just a close. I think aside from the, let's say, the regulation or the over-regulation, what we have as an open source community, we have a positive culture that needs to be, let's say, incorporated in this new environment. And the challenge here, as has been outlined, that unfortunately the open source community suffers from what has been described and documented, the tragedy of commons. Everyone likes to use open source, but very few like to actively contribute into open source. So this, in this new phase, and because of the obvious cybersecurity problems that we are facing as companies, as countries, as European Union, and so on, we have to enter a new phase where actually and actively open source has to be funded. It cannot be continued as such, as a voluntary, let's say, activity. And this is, I mean, is the new characteristic of the new period. And fortunately, the European Union, through the EDIC programs, like the Digital Commons EDIC, the Impact EDIC, and so on, realizes that it has to start. Even the funds that are committing, it's quite small relative to the problems they want to solve. It's a first step. But in order for this first step not to come very late, because we are living in a situation where in a year from now, the impact of artificial intelligence and the new actors will be in a way that, let's say, in a way difficult to estimate the impact. Because we live, as everybody said, in a very peculiar situation. We really don't know what would happen because, let's say, AI and eventually open source is being weaponized by the global actors. And this situation is very difficult situation that we're faced in, and we have to realize the only benefit that we have, and I believe that, is the culture that has been developed in the open source community, either in the software, in the hardware. And this is, let's say, one of our weapons as civil society organizations. And we don't have to underestimate that. This is how we can go forward.
Thank you all. Thank you, everybody.